The expanse of moondew was distorted through the ice dome, giving the water a faint azure glow. In memories not of its own, it which smiles remembered when the moon first wept the great lake into existence for reasons the eternal dreamers did not quite understand. It was an echo of a thought recalled so many times it had lost its texture, not something to be comprehended by the simple likes of it which smiles. Black clouds coalesced in the sky, hugging the sides of the great Nurkov range. They, too, were distorted by the dome, fractured and reconstructed to something much more intricate than they truly were. Tonight, the moon would not have to see the shame of its outburst so many eons ago. Sadov, you are needed at the main gate. The convoy is to arrive within the hour, and Wonkra wants her keymaster on hand. The young man who had spoken to it, Okrunev, was clad in ceremonial plate armor over thick furs, sharp-edged geometrical decorations coated with a thin layer of cobalt. It which smiles, smiled.
She is not usually such a stickler for ceremony.
Okrunev shrugged. We're being visited by Pentark. I wonder what we did to deserve such an honor.
The fact that you don't know should make you suspicious. Pentarks don't travel to the westernmost tip of the realm without reason, and a secret reason is often one that spells doom.
It which smiles steadied itself with a shroomwood cane as it walked. The cold radiated by the ice dome pervaded through many layers of fungal cloth and cave sheep wool, making its body's bones creak. It's been said, we should be careful. Okrunev waited for the keymaster to catch up. The Free Ravens may have sent an assassin, so look out for any black birds. They look like...
I know what they look like.
It which smiles had an inkling that Okrunev had never seen a bird in his life. He had the glassy eyes and pallid complexion of someone who had rarely left the subterranean realm of the Milkesh. His only time spent outside the protection of an ice dome must have been in his training as a Kobold Guardian. It which smiles had seen birds the likes of which no Milkesh would dare imagine. Phoenix macaws so vibrant they looked like they were ablaze, parakeets with feathers like polished gemstones, even ravens blacker than shadow. Sadov might have seen some type of bird that lost its way and ended up this far north over the course of his life. His early memories were fuzzy at times. May I ask something? Okrunev led the way through the frigid passages of the fortress, illuminated by carefully tended patches of glowing fungi. He kept close as it which smiles stumbled down the polished granite steps, the clangor of armor echoing off the walls.
Unless you expect the answer to be no, do ask.
Okrunev puffed. Why do they hate us? Why would they wish to kill their own Pentark?
The Free Ravens. They don't believe their people should be ruled by ours.
We rule them by imperial decree, Okrunev protested.
Which they do not recognize. They are enemies of the Empire.
It which smiles, smiled.
The Abar are different from us. They live under open skies. They don't eat slate snakes and burrow shells. Mold is a pest to them, not something to be cultivated. Most of us only ever see the sun through icy domes. They ride reindeer across the wind-blasted tundra.
Do you believe we should not rule them?
That would be a treasonous thought, wouldn't it? The truth is, it does not matter whether we are the rightful rulers of the Abar, only that we are the rulers of the Abar.
It which smiled remembered living among them, in a different song of memories. He found the Milkesh rather more interesting, but admired the fighting spirit of their southerly subjects. Okrunev moved in a little closer, asking in hushed tones, Do you think the Empire is dying, Sadov?
And where might you have heard such things?
One of the guards in the House of Light. He used to serve with the Imperial Legion, says that in other places, faraway kingdoms, they are being banished. Secession, he says it's called, and the Empire is doing nothing to stop it. It which smiles stopped, leaning its body against a heated column of blue marble.
Paladin of the Lightbringers told you this.
Okrunev shook his head. Just a guard.
Is the House of Light no longer satisfied with the protection of our constables? Are you Kobold Guardians not doing a good enough job?
It chortled as it tapped on Okrunev's armor with its Shrewmud cane. The young man blinked in confusion. I forget, you do not go to the temples. The House of Shadows has guards too. There's been accusations of heresy. I go to both houses from time to time. The Lightbringers are talking about burning away the darkness more and more, and the Shadow Tenders have a lot of sermons about growing our defenses, preserving the order of things.
That's just how they talk. Light cleanses and cauterizes. Shadow grows and preserves. Together they are purity and renewal. But if the duality is truly upset, then maybe the Empire is not long for this world either. You will see interesting times, Okrunev.
It which smiles pushed off the column and set its body back into motion. It hadn't thought about this in a while, but the Eternal Dreamers had sensed such a change in the world's song. They had told it as much when they'd sent it out to this assignment. Of course, I don't know anything about...
I would recommend, my young friend, that you do not speak of such things when the Pentark arrives, especially not about the fall of the Empire. She's a stalwart loyalist.
It isn't my place to have an opinion in any case, Okrunev said earnestly.
And yet, like everyone, you have one.
It which smiles smiled. Little of the daylight coming in through the dome penetrated all the way down to the portal hall. Overhead, a lattice of delicate bridges suspended by fine-spun spider silk loomed, connecting the octagonal houses of the city's financial elite. The wealthier one was, the farther up one lived, though the prestige of a given house could be increased if it was freestanding on one of the 8 mighty pillars instead of protruding from the walls. The portal hall at the very bottom of the shaft was still a place of great importance. Gold and silver filigree framed mosaics of fungal patterns tiled the vaulted ceilings of the alcove around the city's main gate. Blue swirls spiraled around the marble floor, scathed in countless cracks and furrows by the daily traffic of the caravans. As keymaster, It which Smiles kept the gate open on most days, unless there was warning of dangerous critters crawling about the caves around the city. Wonkra had insisted he close it just before the Pentark's arrival, in order to have the ceremony be proper. The plump, dour governor was standing on a wide pedestal in the middle of the portal hall. Usually youths would loiter around it and crack jokes at the expense of passers-by. Today there was a cordon of a dozen kobold guardians, including Okrunev. Crowds of well-dressed socialites and commoners robed in thick rags had gathered overhead, their hushed whispers echoing off the walls. The city's oligarchs were assembled on a small dais, among them the masters of the Houses of Light and Shadow respectively. They were indeed standing as far apart as possible, It which Smiles observed. 5 dull thuds on the portal. It which Smiles looked over to Wonkra, who gave him a somber nod, before producing a gilded key bigger than its hand to unlock the portal. Mechanisms clicked to life as its assistants set off the system of chains and pulleys that parted the doors, revealing the lengthy cavern behind it. The Pentark was laden heavy with gold necklaces and braces over her deep indigo finery. Though she was old, she stood straight, dark eyes scrutinizing It which Smiles with regal authority. Behind her, a small entourage of kobold guardians, courtly aides, and cave guides leading skitamites on silk leashes waited expectantly. It which Smiles genuflected as far as its adult spine permitted, keeping itself steady with the cane as it handed the key over to the Pentark. She accepted it wordlessly as she entered, followed by her retainers. Underneath heavy bags, The chitinous shells of the Skittermites were the color of charcoal, a particularly valuable breed from the east. For the briefest of moments, It Which Smiles found their thudding clicks on the marble disorienting, like it was out of its own body. Beside the Pentark, a shadow tender in black robes, presumably her personal spiritual advisor, cast his skeptical gaze at the city. In times past, this clear declaration of which aspect of the duality the ruler favored had not been unusual, but the Master of the House of Light furrowed her brow disapprovingly nonetheless, and the Master of the House of Shadows had a subtle but unmistakably satisfied expression on her face. "As governor, I welcome you into my city, Strila." Wonkra stepped down from her pedestal and bowed before the Pentark. "As Pentark, I express gratitude for your welcome, Wonkra." Instead of stepping up onto the platform herself, the Pentark handed the key back to the governor, indicated that she had not come to assume direct control of the local administration. A visible sigh of relief went through the oligarchs on the dais. Strila was known for being stringent in her particular way of doing things, never allowing any interest but her own to be pursued. It Which Smiles smiled. It could sense the end of its assignment coming. The ice dome over the governor's palace was immaculate. It was much smaller than the city's main dome, which it overlooked from a craggy precipice. The great metropolises of the Milkesh had many such domes, but this was the only one here. In his youth, Serov had helped in the construction of this extravagant castle. It Which Smiles recalled faint memories of a thin youngster overseeing laborers toiling in the cold to build several scenic terraces. No heat was being pumped up here from within the mountains yet. It had been well worth it for the view, Serov might have thought. It Which Smiles felt that moon dew glowed faintly even in the dark of night. The Pentark certainly seemed to enjoy it. Or maybe she was simply exhausted of the company of others, retreating to a small balcony often. 2 kobold guardians kept away the oligarchs and lower magnates with their constant attempts at winning her over for their own personal agendas. Only the Master of the House of Light seemed disinterested in talking to Strila. It Which Smiles nonetheless observed her speaking to one of her acolytes, while casting disdainful glances out at the balcony. The acolyte nodded, his expression one of barely hidden concern, and rightly so. It was a gesture of extreme audacity. Not even being a high-ranking Lightbringer would fully shield her from the consequences, even given that It Which Smiles suspected only itself had noticed the interaction. The other guests were too busy playing their political games. Velivov was in negotiations with Timsar to ship white obsidian from his deep quarries over Moondew with her fleet. However, Timsar already had an exclusive agreement with Konjal, who was dependent on her business after his idiot daughter had attempted to move wares overland on Skittermites. The entire herd had died hours after leaving the protective warmth of the underworld. But of course, Velivov was an oligarch and, if not the heir apparent, certainly a contender to replace the governor when her term was up. Timsar was truly after a seat as one of his peers, ideally that of Welkia, who unfortunately owned the port through which Timsar did all of her shipping. As Keymaster, It Which Smiles was expected to be uninvolved in all this. The office could open all doors in all the city, and was to serve no one but the governor. If anyone even attempted to gain the Keymaster's favor, both would be killed in short order, a complication It Which Smiles was trying to avoid. It decided to take a little break of its own, to get away from the chatter of all these aristocrats bouncing off the frescoed ceilings. It was getting too loud to think. Okrunev was doing rounds higher up, It Which Smiles knew. The warm slabs of the corridor felt good on its body's feet. The murmurs of the celebrants faded as it descended the spiral staircase under the gaze of the reliefs of previous governors, most of whom had died long before the construction of this edifice. It Which Smiles knew its way around, and not just because of its body's memories. A Keymaster had to know how to move discreetly through the halls of power. It which smiles stirred, not its body, but itself. The faint voices from below turned into a deep chorus, sending vibrations through the tendrils in its body's spine, making it shiver, barely able to hold on to balance with the shroomwood cane. High-pitched notes joined in, sizzling bolts of agony and ecstasy resonating to create a strong, clear body of tones. The Eternal Dreamers were reaching out. Their song was one of desperate terror. It which Smiles had expected that they would be paying attention to the Pentark's visit, as they had deemed it important enough to send an agent. But now that they were hearing the song, they started anticipating a great dissonance. It which Smiles' mission was being amended. The final stirrings of the message abated. It which Smiles had not made sense of it yet, but had already set its body into motion. Even with a decrepit set of bones like this one, it was anything but feeble. With joints creaking and quavering muscles protesting in pain, It which Smiles ran up the stairs, using the cane to make up for the strength its body lacked. Cold radiated from the ice dome onto the rooftop colonnade. The web of slime on the ceiling glowed faintly. It which Smiles had to lean its body against the wall, wheezing from exertion, but nonetheless listening. Aside from the chit-chat of the festivities, there was the lazy clatter of a kobold guardian somewhere below. A stray bird was fluttering above, though It which Smiles could not see it. It took a moment to realize what that meant. It which Smiles paced lightly to the edge of the colonnade, shroomwood cane in hand. It tried listening to the song with its tendrils, focusing on the tones spun around it, drumming with almost deafening momentousness. Though it lacked the experience and sheer thinking power of the Eternal Dreamers, it was versed enough to anticipate the following note in a given melody. It was not, however, proficient enough to hit the large raven square in the head as it dove from its perch. The bird's call sounded like a curse as it was struck in the side, pirouetting between two columns before catching itself and transforming into a cloud of black feathers, then reassembling into a man with taut muscles and weathered skin. He wore a leather jerkin covered in elegant Abar symbols. A black glamour flickered over the free raven's eyes, and a broad, flat blade shone in his hand. It which Smiles shirked back from his sudden strike, listening attentively to the song. Confusion was writ large on the assassin's face as it parried the next three strike with its cane, supplanted by shock as its body lurched forward and struck him in the shoulder. The Free Raven must not kill the Pentark. The instruction from the Eternal Dreamers could not be clearer. Somewhere below, a voice that sounded like Okrunev demanded to know what was happening up here. The Free Raven acted faster than It which Smiles anticipated, overwhelming it with the speed of raw reflexes. It held up the cane to block an arcing slice, but not quickly enough. Warm blood spurted from its body's neck, seeping down into its many layers of clothing as its heart, pumping in horror, kept pushing it out. Vision darkened at the corners. The Free Raven stepped back, stowed his blade, and transformed back into a bird as Serov the Keymaster collapsed. It which Smiles had no time to lose. With a conscious effort of will, it detached its incisors from the dying man's brainstem, ripped itself free from the tendrils that had grown in his spine, and began pushing itself into his nasal cavity, wiggling its blood-coated body through the sinuses. Flesh ripped as it gored itself through the mucus and muscle of Serov's nose. Cold air brushed its anterior sensing plate. It which Smiles ripped open half of its old body's nose, violently pushing free, trailing incisors still covered in brain matter. As it crawled away from the warm corpse, it realized just how dire the situation was. It was frigid under the ice dome, and It which Smiles didn't have the size of a skitamite to keep itself from freezing solid, especially with the wet layer of bilious slime surrounding it. It dashed over the side of the colonnade, sensing the vibrations of armor, smelling the dull aroma of cobalt and the acerbic stench of bird. They were going in different directions. Somekov Serov in it already regretted what it was about to do to the kind and sincere Okrunev, but Itwich Smiles did not have the luxury of thinking about such things now. It was driven by purpose, a mission that needed to be accomplished, no matter the cost. It quivered as it impacted the hard granite floor below, then skidded toward the vague humanoid shape with the cobalt smell. Okrunev uttered a series of sounds Itwich Smiles could not interpret, trying to swipe it off his armor as it nimbly crawled up the furs and pelts, guided by the pulsating warmth of his neck and the fresh yet ever so slightly putrid scent of his breath. Primal relief flooded Itwich Smiles as it entered Okrunev's mouth. The warmth was soothing, and the wriggling tongue's massage of its ventral plate was almost pleasant as it worked to push back against Itwich Smiles' inevitable incursion. It squirted nerve-dulling venom as it pushed past Okrunev's tonsils, carving a bloody path through his uvula before wriggling itself through his sinuses, shearing away membranes and flesh, coating everything in its own secretions to avoid infection. Itwich Smiles flipped as it bored itself into the young guard's brain, lodging its body safely at the top of his spine. It could feel him shake his head back and forth with agony as its incisors probed for the right spot. Satisfied, Itwich Smiles drove itself deep into its new body's brainstem, consuming Okrunev's mind, getting a first taste of fresh and untainted memories as it erased and supplanted him. It was a process that usually took a lot longer than this, but when Itwich Smiles saw the soaring raven through its new sharp eyes, it remembered to hurry. The new body was even more athletic than Itwich Smiles had anticipated. Okrunev was agile and powerful, imbued with the reflexes of a trained warrior. While running, it unsheathed the two Ruvyak swords on its back. The single-edged short swords had a broad, four-pitched blade near the point, able to cut but also deliver devastating blows in confined quarters. As befitted a warrior of his station, these were well crafted and inlaid with cobalt decoration. Itwich Smiles took 2 steps at a time down an exterior stairwell, from one terrace to the one below, eyes on the raven. The bird was sailing through the air at a tilt, one of its wings not beating as freely as the other. Without the benefit of spinal tendrils grown over a decade of inhabiting the same body, Itwich Smiles found itself cut off from the song, unable to predict its opponent's next gyre. Bracing itself, it slid down the slope of a flat marble roof, shooting onto a half-height balcony on a freestanding turret, and using its momentum to shoulder through the light shroomwood door. 2 servant girls gasped as they were pushed out of the way, spilling hot water all over the floor. Itwich Smiles pulled back its arms as it crashed through yet another door onto another balcony. Aware of his pursuer, the free raven had nonetheless followed the only path he could, soaring in a flat arc near the ice dome, picking up speed in his descent, to kill the Pentark quickly, before the alarm had spread through the palace. Throwing the entire weight of its body into the motion, Itwich Smiles hurled the Ruvyak in its hand. The sword spun in the air, racing to impale the bird. He cawed in agitation, throwing a hateful glance at Itwich Smiles as he arrested his flight and spiraled around the whirling weapon, evading doom by half a pace. A deafening crack resounded through the palace as the blade bored itself into the ice dome. The force of the impact cracked a major fracture into the structure. Around the sword, a network of fissures was rapidly expanding. At the very least, Itwich Smiles had bought the Pentark a few moments. It climbed over the balustrade and dropped to a narrow terrace below, relishing the ease with which these young knees absorbed the impact. Below, the assembled guests exclaimed in shock as they spotted the cracks in the ice dome. Itwich Smiles could only hope they would also notice the assassin soaring down toward the Pentark's little balcony. Panic would soon spread, and getting the ruler surrounded by kobold guardians would be an immediate priority. But the voices shouting had the exasperated tang of aristocrats, not the urgent clangor of guards. The Free Raven had not been spotted. Everything still hinged on Itwich Smiles. Pitching sideways, he came darting around a spire. The assassin most likely had eyes on the Pentark this very moment. Burning all the youthful strength in its body, Itwich Smiles sprinted right to the edge of the roof and leapt. It could feel the heavy furs and plate pulling it down the 2 floors to the balcony, where the Pentark was still standing, arms outstretched, pointing at the Free Raven. "Out of the way!" it warned. Okrunev's voice sounded odd in its own head. The Pentark looked up, dark eyes wide with concern as she saw the kobold guardian dropping towards her, the tip of its ruviak pointed down. She wheezed as she was yanked back by a guard who must have spotted the assassin, but not Itwich Smiles. In midair, the Free Raven again transformed into a cloud of black feathers, then into a man. The sudden change in weight arrested some of the flight's momentum, allowing for an elegant landing on the balustrade. With perfect balance, the assassin veered forward to, in one swift motion, slice open the Pentark's throat with his black blade, only to meet the hard steel of Okrunev's ruviak. Itwich Smiles coiled around its body's spine as its legs collapsed under it. The cracking of bones and tearing of ligaments whipped through its nerves. It barely managed to retract the according incisor in time to avoid being overwhelmed by a wave of agony. The Free Raven gave it a look of silent fury, but seemingly expected it to be out of commission from the pain. He attempted to vault over the kobold guardian to get at his target. The caw he let out as Itwich Smiles forced its body to stand up, grabbing the Free Raven by the waist and plummeting them both down to the terrace below, reverberated with magical force. Brilliant clamor echoed back from the dome as it cracked. Shards of perfectly clear ice started to rain on the governor's palace. The Free Raven coughed blood as he absorbed most of the impact on the blue jade and marble floor below. Itwich Smiles could feel his blade cutting into the side of its body, sharp enough to penetrate through the furs. But it had him pinned, its ruviak still in hand. The assassin lifted his arm in vain, trying to lock Itwich Smiles' elbow as it drove the tip of the short sword through his throat. The Free Raven gargled. His blood spread across the floor. The black glamour on his eyes dissolved as he died. Amber irises full of contempt stared up at the man who had stopped him from assassinating one of his people's greatest oppressors. Little did he know. Itwich Smiles rolled over sideways, aware of the deafening pain pulsating through its body but unwilling to touch it. Armor clanked as several kobold guardians came running to its aid. Behind them was a gaggle of guests, among them Strila herself. Itwich Smiles smiled. The Pentark hurried over to it, gratitude on her face. The man who saved her life tonight would become a hero. Surviving an assassination was a political narrative with great power, and she was likely already mulling over several ways in which she could instrumentalize Okrunev as her savior. "What is your name, Guardian?" Itwich Smiles croaked, barely able to move one finger as it beckoned her closer. Several of Okrunev's compatriots, their identities slowly assembled from the young man's memories, were kneeling around him. The Pentark leaned down, acquiescing to the dying wish of the young man who had most likely given his life, but at least his legs, to save her. The surprise on her face when Itwich Smiles plunged the ruviak into her belly was exquisite. "The Pentark named Strila must be killed by a Milkesh of great standing." This had been its initial assignment, the reason Itwich Smiles had come to this place to begin with. Even as the Eternal Dreamers had reached out with their warning, they had made certain to repeat it, so there would be no ambiguity. The Pentark had to die, just not by the Free Raven's hand. The plan had been for Serov to carry out the murder, but now that Okrunev was a hero, it was just the same. Either of them made for a Milkesh of great standing. It which smiled as the kobold guardians around it realized what had happened. The onlookers erupted in shock. "No!" Wonkra screamed as the Pentark slumped over the blade that had impaled her. It which smiles let go of the Ruvyak, allowing the old ruler to be pulled away. Everyone around was too confused to behead the killer then and there. But death did come, inevitably. Its new body was brimming with youthful vigor. Given enough time, it might have healed from some of its injuries, though it which smiles wouldn't have expected it to walk again without aid. It did not matter. Okrunev was a killer slated for execution, and whether the victim had been a craftsman or a Pentark, the Milkesh knew only one method of execution. It which smiles had no fear, as its body was stripped and drenched in cold water. The master of the House of Light sanctified the death as just punishment, and announced that a society without Okrunev would be one that was cleansed of an unworthy soul. It which smiles could not help but notice just how little conviction the Lightbringer spoke with. Naked and wet, it which smiles was carried out of the city through a small side gate off the guard's garrison. Icy air blasted the glacial cliffs of the Nurkov range, immediately penetrating through to the bone. From its stretcher, it which smiles could see the frost mages reassembling the ice dome over the governor's palace. There were hundreds of naked corpses in the crevice below, skin black with ice burns, but bodies well preserved. As it was dumped down into the pile, it noticed how tired they all looked. Freezing to death was said to be like falling asleep. It which smiles smiled. All in all, with its purpose fulfilled, it wasn't a bad way to go. The cough was virulent. Brute force ripped it out of the darkness. It which smiles convulsed, feeling the searing pain of unforgiving frost on its body. It curled, sitting up in its cot, falling against the side of the tent, head spinning. "Easy there," a man said, his accent guttural, but the language unmistakably Abar. Streaks of grey ran through his dark hair and ruddy beard. He wore the bulky felt garbs of a shaman, but his tent was full of hooks, robes, and pythons, the tools of a mountaineer. "Who are you?" It which smiles noticed that its voice was that of a little girl. Memories of her frightful final moments, fighting the shaman as he pushed the strange 10-legged creature into her mouth with a pair of cast iron tongs, thawed in its mind. Thawed. Yes. It had thawed. "Runs with lizards. I apologize for the body. It is all I could find." It which smiles shook its head, but stopped when the world began spinning again. "I have never heard your name." "I was spawned while you were away," Runs with Lizards explained. "The Eternal Dreamers had 2 broods in a century?" Runs with Lizards laughed. 3, actually. "How is that even possible?" "I am afraid recovering you took longer than expected. You're quite the legend, you know. The Dreamers sent you out to sow confusion among the royalty of the Milkesh. Not even they could have foreseen just how much chaos followed in the wake of a Pentark being killed by a guard that had just saved her." "How long was I frozen?" "Let me think." Runs with Lizards handed It which smiles a cup of hot tea. "The Shadow Tenders were eradicated in the War of Illumination. That happened soon after you were executed, In many places, at least, it might feel ironic that they are still preaching in Nurkov. Half a century later, the Empire fell, which was your goal, of course. The tea warmed its body in a way it had not known for longer than it could remember. I only knew my assignment, not its purpose. Things have changed. The Eternal Dreamers were forced to take a more active hand in things. Dissonance in the song is growing. It which smiles down the rest of the tea, scalding its body's throat. I will serve, loyally. Runs with lizards nodded. There is much work to do, but not for you. We will depart for the coast in a few days. You're going back to the reef. The Eternal Dreamers want to hear your song in person. It which smiles, smiled. Finally, after all these years, it was going home.